Hello, this is John Quinlan. Welcome to this edition of Forward Forum. We're here in the Sun Prairie Media Center on April 10th, 2015, with a very interesting show. It's the second in two parts of a show that we've been doing, interviews with Bonnie Block. Bonnie is here joining us here on April 10th, about a week and a couple of days after Bonnie went to jail for justice. And in our last show, we had a chance to discuss some of the reasons that you were there, and perhaps we should bring folks who are new to this subject up to date a bit. But Bonnie essentially was part of a protest against drone warfare that was occurring up at Volk Field in Juneau County. And Bonnie decided when she was faced with charges of trespassing to pursue this through the courts, eventually went to trial again earlier here in April of 2015, and her decision was to serve a jail sentence. So she'll explain a little bit more about the context of that, and we'll talk about her experiences in going through a trial, in being in jail for 4 days and 5 nights, 5 days, 4 days
right.
and 5 nights, I did get that right. And also, we're going to focus on more this time, where last time we focused specifically on the motivations around drone warfare, the nature of what that phenomenon is all about. Bonnie also is someone who is an active advocate in the area of what's called restorative justice, addressing the inequities in our prison systems, the way that we treat people, the ways we need to support people more who are coming out of that system, and also supporting their families. So Bonnie Block, welcome back to Forward Forum.
Thank you.
I know we resolved, we wanted to have the chance after what is probably a pretty extraordinary experience for a lot of folks, thinking about taking a stand, deciding to go to jail. We of course noted all the historic precedents that there are other folks over time who have made similar decisions. But let's revisit, if we could, just briefly at least, why you did this. Why was this issue of standing up against drone warfare important to dictate this choice?
Well, I've been part of a group called the Wisconsin Coalition to Ground the Drones since December of 2011. And we do a monthly vigil, and then periodically we also cross the line at the gates of Volk Field. That is the Wisconsin Air National Guard base, where there are operators being trained in flying shadow drones. They're part of the whole system. They don't carry the weapons, they carry the cameras that do the surveillance. Father Jim Murphy and I, last May, went to the open house. We took a bus tour. When we got off the bus at the National Guard Museum, we handed out a leaflet. And it had 4 questions. The first one was, would you be anxious if there was a drone flying over your home? The second one talked about, would a large gathering at your neighbor's make you nervous because it might attract a drone and you might be killed? It also asked, would you know that you have a right to due process rather than a targeted assassination? And it was interesting. The National Guard personnel immediately surrounded us and said, you can't do that here. That's propaganda. They hadn't read it, but they knew. So anyway, it's been a long saga. I did a motion to dismiss. The district attorney did a motion in limine where he limited on with the judge's agreement. I couldn't talk about constitutional law. I couldn't talk about international law. I couldn't talk about my moral or ethical beliefs that led me to do what I did. I couldn't even talk about the golden rule.
Right.
So I went to trial, which was April 1st. It was a 6-person jury. And it took the morning till about 1 from 8:30, and I was found guilty. And I had drafted a statement, if that happened, that I was not going to pay the fine. I was going to go to jail as a public witness against drones.
So we'll take up with that narrative in a minute. We have some pictures to go along with some of this. If we could maybe also share, Mara, the picture of Bonnie and some of the protests that she's been a part of, some of the political work she's done around this. Again, just our emphasis today is on restorative justice and reflections now that you've done something that most grandmothers haven't experienced in Madison. You've gone to jail, and you've had a chance to talk to folks And this is an issue that you've worked on for a long time.
Yeah.
But going back to the drones issue.
Right.
So you mentioned your companion here. This is
Father Jim Murphy from Highland. This was a vigil we did on the day of the open house in front of the gates. And those are the kinds of signs we have. We have also met, we try to educate people about the drones. So we have also met with Congressman Mark Bocan about our concerns over drones and about how we felt it makes us less safe rather than more safe. Because, we had, after 9/11, we were very unhappy in this country, and we started 2 wars. There have been over 500 drone strikes. And can you imagine the number of people who feel angry toward us? And so that was our message to him.
remember reading online, there was a particular, a former general, I think, who had been in charge of a lot of our policy implementation in Afghanistan. He just made that exact point. He just said, what I learned the more that we implemented this drone policy is we were creating enemies. We were creating people not advancing the American cause. We were creating people that understandably were very, very upset with us, and we were creating going in the wrong direction entirely.
Yeah. What I always say is I think drones are immoral, illegal, and ineffective.
Right.
They really do not make us safer. One of the photos that was up a little while ago, we also try to have a little bit of a sense of humor about this. And so one of our signs says, fly kites, not drones.
That's right.
And we actually made some T-shirts as a way of funding some of our work too. So, but it's a serious issue. But what we're always told is the military at Oakfield say, we're just following orders. Go talk to your congressmen. And so we have done that,
Yeah.
and our senators. And it is an issue that I think we really need to pay more attention to because it's part of our whole militarism. And after being in jail for the 5 days, it's kind of militarism come home.
Yeah.
Because the jail experience was interesting. I was in a pod. The Juneau County Jail is actually much better than the Dane County Jail, which I have toured. It was built in 2002 rather than in 1953, which is where part of the building that houses part of the jail on the City County building in Madison was built in 53, has bars. This was like a large cinder block room. And I was the 7th woman coming in. It's fairly stark, nothing on the walls except one TV.
And I think we have a picture just to give some sense of how stark things are. Just a basic picture of a cell with a television set there, but.
Yeah, well, basically we had an area that was common room. These are more individual cells. Ours were broken up into sort of 4 bunks, and then there was a window, but the window you could not see through. And so they weren't even rooms. They were just sort of divided somewhat. But they are very stark. It's a metal bunk bed. It's
not a lot of space.
Not a lot of space. You have the pad that one of the interesting things was after I got in, you get 2 sheets and a blanket and a pillow. And I put them down on my number 2 bunk was mine. And then I went and introduced myself to some of the other women. And then I went back and I was going to make my bed, and one of the women came with me. She said, "There's a little trick to this. The sheets only covered 2/3 of the mat that was the mattress, and you had to tie them just the right places together, and then it would cover the whole thing." So they taught me how to do this.
So we're a little out of order here. We're going to go back to the trial, but I think one other thing we wanted to mention is, people have watched this cable series, the Orange is the New Black. But you actually wore an orange jumpsuit, and perhaps we can share that photo from the series just to evoke this. This is not all that different from what you experienced.
No, except we didn't have the bars.
Right.
But yeah, it is precisely that. And I think because I thought the trial was unfair was part of the reason that I really felt I needed to make a stand and do the jail time.
Just while we're on this picture again, we'll come back to those things. But again, You fit the orange jumpsuit, but this is another thing we're going to talk about. A lot of the women you met, the 6 women who shared the pod with you, were actually very friendly and very supportive, and so you were getting cold,
Yes.
in this jumpsuit.
Well, one of the things was, yeah, I had the short sleeve blouse and the pants, which are stamped on the back and down the front leg with Juneau County Jail. But when you get booked in, everything is put in storage. You can't take in anything except I was able to take my paperback Bible and I took my inhaler. But my turtleneck sweater and my socks were the wrong color, and therefore I could not take them along. And so I was kind of cold because you also have orange plastic clogs or
Right.
flip-flops, whatever you want to call them, without socks. And so I had gotten a towel to put around my shoulders, thinking, because we got a towel and a washcloth too. And I was wearing it like a shawl. So the voice from the intercom comes and says, "Ladies, will you tell the new person what the rules are?" So the rules are that you may not cover your neck or your face. And so I put the towel back and sort of was rubbing my arms like you do when you're sort of chilly.
Yeah.
And immediately one of the women went to her box. You get a storage box that's about like so by like so. And she came back with a white thermal long-sleeved shirt for me to wear. And another woman came with a white pair of socks. Regulation white was the key. And it was just so amazing to me because they didn't know me. Here I was. I had told them, who I was and why I was in. But, and I kind of feel, and thinking about reversing the situation, I would kind of think, well, who is this here that comes in voluntarily? Mm-hmm. But they were very courteous to me and to each other.
So this notion that you were in with hardened criminals or people who
No,
were
well-
dangerous, presenting a threat, that
No, several of them were charged with serious crimes.
Right.
That would be felonies. But 5 of the 6 didn't have their trial yet. They were there because they couldn't post bail. They were there. One was there in a probation hold, and so so many people end up in jail when you shouldn't be there before you're convicted.
yeah.
And even then, I sort of wonder whether I keep thinking about Debbie, what's her name, the woman that was sentenced to a year. What that meant was she was really like in a box for a year with no access to the natural world.
Yeah.
With only, visiting is 1 hour. Well, you have to set it up 24 hours in advance. It's 1 hour a week on Sunday evenings. Men get 3 days, but women just get 1 because there's so few in the jail, I was told. But can you imagine sort of being in that kind of situation
Yeah.
for a year? The idea being that jails are a short-term thing, and therefore, you don't need outside places. They have a, quote, rec room, which I ended up being in one time because they also did what they call a shakedown. One evening, 3 guards appeared, set everybody out in the hallway. We were patted down, sent off to this rec room, and then they searched everything. They went through our boxes. They took everything apart on our beds. They were looking for, quote, contraband.
Yeah.
And it was just so stupid. But anyway, I got to see the rec room, which was nothing more than one big exercise, machine where you could, I think it had a treadmill and you could do push-ups or sit-ups. And then it had a rather pathetic library. It had, a bookshelf with, I think, 3 shelves of books, paperback books that you could borrow. But there's very little programming. The night I came in Wednesday evening, there was, quote, Bible study. And it was done by a very evangelical woman who, there were 4 of us, and 3 of the women, I felt it from their stories, had been severely victimized. And it was the give it to Jesus, which I'm Christian, but I really find it very difficult to be telling women who have been victimized not to be angry and not to,
Well, the philosophy, it sounds like, that there was an assumption that these were women who were broken, or there was an assumption that,
Yeah.
you think about all the stereotypes of all the movies you've seen about women in jail, that it's a matter of people who become less than human. But I think what you're describing is more that the circumstances that brought them there, the conditions of the jail, were in fact what was inhumane.
Yes, and they were all in their 20s or 30s. One woman was 57, and of course I was like the grandmother. But they're young women, and between them, there were at least 12 children that were left without a mother. Several were in foster care. Others were being taken care of by relatives. And again, why not do a day reporting center? Why not do a bracelet? Why not do alternatives so that people don't have to stay in jail?
Right.
And as Judge Curran mentioned, he was concerned about my costing the county money. Well, these would be much cheaper ways of having people be in their normal circumstances while they're awaiting the
Serving
the
people-
trial or whatever is going to happen.
Obviously, serving people in the community is always much easier than serving someone in an institution. And then
Exactly.
you don't have all the restrictions and all the other things that are not like the real world, where you actually
Right.
have support and you have a chance to interact and you have a chance
Exactly.
to make a difference. So
Exactly.
I want to take us back just so we make sure we tell the court part of the story here, and you're alluding to it with Judge Curran. But we can go back and perhaps just to again show you're standing, I think, in front of the jail. Actually, let's go back a little bit further than that to the map, if we could, Mara. Show people where this is taking place. This is up in the city of Mauston, in central Wisconsin. So maybe about a third of the way up the interstate between Madison and Minneapolis. And it is a small rural county.
That's right.
Again, that's where Volk Field is, the Air
Yes.
Force Base.
And in many ways, that isn't a surprise, I think. Volk Field is there, and just a little bit further up the road is Fort McCoy. And in fact, we've found out since that Fort McCoy also has shadow drones. But it's the second largest employer. And so obviously the people there need the employment. And in fact, there's 2 judges in Juneau County, and Judge Curran was the judge appeared before, and the other one is Judge Romer. And he has recused himself from any of these cases because his son works at Volk Field.
We're showing a picture now of Judge Curran, who's the
Yeah.
judge in your case. Okay.
And I think he tries to be fair, but he sees this in a very narrow way. It's, you were on the base, they told you to leave, you didn't leave, end of story.
Okay.
And therefore he doesn't want to hear about why we would be concerned about drone warfare, why we would want to see the base, why we would want to leaflet.
I think what we're showing is
Yeah,
another,
the
we showed just now
courtroom.
was another trial. This happens to be the same courtroom that you
Yes,
were in, though, right?
it was the same courtroom. I had just
and just the other aspect of this was a jury trial. And you
Right.
specifically asked for that kind of a trial because,
well, for 2 reasons. I've been arrested now 3 times and gone to trial twice. And the first was a bench trial before Judge Curran. And because of this, very limited viewpoint, I decided that I wanted to try to explain to the citizens of Juneau County why it was that I was on the base. And I was there to see, truly I was there to see what was done at the base and what happened. But I also wanted to explain my reasons. And because of the pretrial motions, I was totally unable to do that. And so I didn't testify at all. I didn't call any witnesses because both Father Jim and I would have been bound by this rule of you can't talk about why. And I had subpoenaed the commander of the base, Romold is his name, and I did that months ago. And about a week before, I got a letter from an attorney for the National Guard who said that he was not going to appear because they are only bound by Defense Department directives, and they don't pay attention to state law. They have there's a very precise way in which you can subpoena them, and the judge has to approve, and it didn't happen.
so these contradictions are pretty obvious, but it's patently absurd that you would go to trial for something where the circumstances were dictated by this military commander, how he defined the circumstances of who could visit and who was trespassing, who wasn't, and he was the one who essentially enforced the order against you, et cetera. But he exists in a world in which he's not accountable to the same system on which you were put on trial. So how, I mean, it just sounds, again, it's a circular logic. It's something, there's no way you could have won. And as you pointed out, you were charged with trespassing, and yet you were part of an open house. You had been invited, as had other members of the public, onto the base. When they got you there and they discovered that you had this innocuous piece of paper that we displayed earlier with those 4 questions, they decided you were some kind of a threat. You were, this is under the category of propaganda. That's not, that's not required. They surrounded you and asked you to leave, but then
There was no way of leaving.
There's no way to leave because they were
Right.
surrounding you. There's no way off the base. So all these absurdities.
Yes, yes. And it was interesting. The district attorney, one of his, well, 2 things that I found, I don't even know what the right word is, I was appalled at. One was that he made a big point, both in the voir dire, the questioning of the jury before we had, because 35 people actually were part of the jury pool, and that was narrowed down to 6. The judge asked questions, and we had a chance to have people struck from the jury. But he made a big deal about how there was a van following every bus, and people who wanted to leave earlier could. Now, that was news to me, because
Right.
nobody on, the narrator on the National Guard bus never mentioned that. And the other thing is he went on and on about trespassing is entering and remaining on the property of another. And the issue was, did I remain when I couldn't leave? And he said, well, I may have been invited, but it's like somebody coming to dinner and then staying for the week, and the analogy wasn't even accurate.
I was at a friend's house and we were watching all episodes of Perry Mason, which maybe is, I don't know if it's completely the standard for things that were happening, but I remember watching some trials where, I'm sorry, the prosecutor or the defense attorney are not allowed to just say this is true. They have to bring in witnesses. They have to bring in people that explain these things. But since the head of the base and none of his personnel were there, then suddenly he's assuming that role, and that's not supposed to happen, right?
There actually were there. He did call 2 witnesses.
Okay.
One of them was the base security person, and he's not actually a member of the National Guard. They must apparently contract this out. He's
Right.
So he did testify, and the other person was the deputy sheriff that arrested me, and so those 2 people did try, but neither of them were National Guard people.
Did you have a chance to question them, or?
Yeah, I could do a cross-exam. But I think, again, because I couldn't get into the rationale for why we were there, I think that's part of the reason that the jury found me guilty. And I think the other thing is that, this is an important part of their community.
Right.
Because of the jobs it provides.
So ironically, a jury of your peers was influenced by the fact that there was this culture in a rural, struggling economically area that they're dependent on the military base. And of course, you never really had a chance to paint the bigger picture, explain all of this, or put in perspective, as we talked about the last time we sat down. You're not anti-military, you're not anti-veteran, you're not against all of this stuff.
No.
None of this could be brought out because they
Right.
narrowed the scope of what you could talk about.
They did, and I didn't testify because the oath you take is you're going to tell the truth and whole truth and nothing but the truth. And I
Right.
didn't feel I could do that, so I didn't feel
And your protest is specifically to say, here in Wisconsin at Volk Field, we do not want to be complicit in drone warfare.
Correct.
We weren't saying shut down the space. We weren't saying,
No.
again, that we should disregard or disrespect any of the people involved. But none of that was clear because it couldn't be stated.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did tell the judge I didn't think it was a fair outcome and that I thought it set a bad precedent for people who, actually all over the country, are doing actions of civil resistance to bases where drone warfare is happening.
And we mentioned this last time, but again,
Yeah.
Kathy Kelly, who's someone who's come to Madison very frequently, a case in point, she's in jail for 3 months now?
3 months, yes, in Whitman Air
Kentucky.
Base. I think they're charged with misdemeanors.
Yeah.
So that is one thing I have to give the district attorney. He has been charging us with trespassing. I mean, the arrests by the sheriff are always for misdemeanors and disorderly conduct and trespassing. But the district attorney has been lowering it. And I also have to, in fairness, I have to also say, in spite of my feelings about how the conditions at the Juneau County Jail are, I want to say inhumane, because I don't think human beings ought to be treated that way. And although I also have to say they're better than
The Dane County Jail.
the Dane County Jail, which I've toured a couple of times. But I think what there was one thing about it that was good. I have, when you went in, you saw a nurse, and she asked about medications, and there was also, a lot of questions about suicide, which is a whole other thing. If somebody is suicidal, they shouldn't be put in jail.
Right.
And so there were those questions. But they have a way of, she bags up or puts in little envelopes your medications, and then 3 times a day a deputy sheriff comes around, and you get your little envelope, and you have to swallow it with water, and you have to open your mouth to show you haven't kept it in your cheek. But I didn't get all of my medication back, and so a couple of days later I did talk to the nurse, and we actually had a very pleasant conversation. She is local, as is the doctor who takes care of people. Dane County, by contrast, hires some sort of for-profit company from Nashville to do the health care. And so I do have to say this is something Juneau County is doing that I think is
By and large,
good.
the people that you were in jail with were from that area, right?
Yeah, most of them. I think all except one were from Juneau County, and one of them was from Monroe County, which is Necedah and that area, and they're in the process of building a new jail.
Yeah.
So, but an interesting statistic: 70 to 80% of the people in jail, in Juneau County Jail, the nurse said, are on medication, which I think tells you again about the health issues of depression, issues of whatever, and we really need to do so much better than we're doing.
And we can talk about this at greater length, but it's just the obvious thing that in an era, or in the course of your lifetime, we have deinstitutionalized people with mental health challenges, but we're not adequately treating them. And very often there's an intersection with folks who struggle with mental health issues and the people who end up in jail.
Exactly, and there in this country now there are more people, mentally ill people, in jails and prisons than in hospitals or treatment centers.
Oh, wow.
I mean, and in Dane County, which is I'm more familiar with, I know the numbers, it's about a third of those in the Dane County Jail who are mentally ill. And what in heaven's name are we doing that for?
Yeah.
You know, it is not appropriate. Because almost all of these folks are going to come back to their communities. In fact, one of the questions I would ask, because you have to pass the time, and so we did puzzles, and we played card games, and we played Scrabble. But there was conversation, and I asked several women, what's the one thing you think would help the most if they changed? And she said, we need programs. If there were, treatment programs, educational programs, we could leave here better than we came in. I mean, she was smart. She knew what the scoop is.
Yeah.
And one of the other women I was struck by, she was in her 50s. She said, in some ways, this is a glorified babysitting operation, and they shouldn't be hiring deputies who are in their 20s because they don't know what to do. So, I mean, they could see what was happening, and they knew all the guards. They knew, who was sort of to be trusted and who would be difficult and who would, what their shifts were. And especially because you have every hour 2 guards come through and they walk through the whole place. They go upstairs to, and they check the bathrooms. Again, it's sort of overkill. It's a mentality in many ways, I think, of collective punishment.
Yeah.
I took in, for example, a notepad and a pencil or pen, and I couldn't take it in to the pod because in the past some people have slit the cardboard and put drugs inside.
It was a spiral notebook, and there was some
And
danger
the
with
spiral,
metal
the metal was also a
So-
no-no.
Right.
But it's whatever somebody once did means nobody can ever do anything.
And your impulse was to tell them.
Well, this is ridiculous, but I had decided I would.
What you were telling me the other day was your impulse was to say, why don't you treat us all like individuals? We are not going to
Well,
do
yeah,
something
that-
that someone did 30 years ago.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
But I tried to cool it.
Sure. Sure. But anyway, again, to make the point, though, it sounds like again, it's like a minefield. Anything that's ever gone wrong in the past, then a policy,
It gets developed.
responds
Right,
to that.
exactly.
But that one-size-fits-all approach really doesn't make
No.
sense if
No,
you're
it doesn't.
dealing with people.
And yet, I think that is what happens when you have an institutional, kind of mindset, and also, I guess the other thing, in fairness, there is the fact that we as a country and we as local units of government, we've been made fearful, and so we are very aware of any possible problems. I mean, this tough on crime stuff is really a matter of, because we're afraid of the other, we don't want to deal with it. We want any possible problems to be squelched, and you take care of it.
Yeah.
And so I think like the sheriff's department ends up then feeling like, okay, we got to deal with this somehow, rather than saying, hey, this isn't how it should go.
So I want to back away and deal with some bigger picture implications of some of this. And then I want to, you mentioned that you've spent some time in the Dane County Jail. I also have experience in some of the programs and other things that have been developed there over the years. So I want to talk about that. But the one thing that strikes me as we come back, and for those of us who are just joining us in midstream, my guest here is Bonnie Block, and we're talking about her recent experience and having gone to jail for justice, essentially having spent a little less than a total of about 5 days up in Mauston in the Junie County Jail, and this was in connection to a protest of drone warfare at Folk Field. Last time we talked at length about drone warfare issues, but there's another element that's very important to you, which is this idea of restorative justice. So what I wanted to, in bringing these bigger themes, you talked about this phenomenon of militarism dominating our lives, the post 9/11 world, that everything has to be justified in terms of national security. I know we've also touched on the notion that our police departments, you mentioned last time, the Madison police have a tank, for goodness sake. Why do they need a tank?
Juneau County does too.
Do they? So they've been giving these tanks for $1 or whatever, and all this police mentality. So I mean, militarism or placing national security. I mean, it's not that national security isn't important, but when it compromises your way of life and the way you treat people, there's something wrong with that. And it seems like that's the theme, whether it's drone warfare or whether it's how we treat people in the correction system.
Exactly. I mean, I see a direct link both because of our fear and also because of our wanting to protect our stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We are willing to use force to ensure that we're safe and we're protected. And, drone warfare, we're told, is because it keeps our military out of harm's way and it gets the bad guys, and therefore it's okay to do. And we're told that there's bad people in the community, we've got to lock them up because otherwise we won't be safe, and so we keep building new jails.
A lot of rationalizations that come out of exploiting fear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is a fear-based thing. And I think, that we're afraid, and so we put people in jail, and then the powers that be make the people in jail afraid. I mean, it becomes a very destructive
You and I
thing.
share an experience in working with a group called the United Nations Association, and a lot of the work that we both do is in international social justice. And the great part about that is it lets us see how the rest of the world deals with some of the same challenges that we're dealing with in the United States. In terms of whether it's juvenile justice, where we put in, next nearest country is South Africa, by a factor of 5, we outdo them. And they're just the ones that are closest to us, but it's by a factor of 15 or 20. Or there are even countries in the world that just don't believe in putting young people in jail. And the same thing in terms of the disproportionate numbers of our people, especially people of color who are in jail.
And poor people.
So how did we get to that point? Is the United States that much more affected by crime? Or is there some kind of rationale that's based on this is something just needed to happen? Or is it more coming back to that construct of fear, short-sightedness, and all the people who make money off of the military, in the case of drones, or the correction system?
Yes. I think our fears have been pandered to.
Yeah.
I think that Reagan was the beginning of the drug wars, and that I think was a very clear-coded thing against people of color. They're dangerous. They're doing drugs, and huge numbers of people in the jail. I didn't pry, so I don't know exactly, but I believe that 4 out of the 6 people in the pod had issues of drug addiction or drug crimes. And addiction is a disease. We need to be treating it. But it also makes a lot of money.
Yeah.
And you know, so much of our foreign policy, I mean, the things we're doing in Mexico and Central America to try to prevent people from coming here, because that will somehow stop drugs. No, it doesn't work. Treatment is what would work, but not interdiction, and not huge amounts of money, and not incarcerating a whole bunch of people.
So to bring this back to the level of Dane County, of course, this has implications for the nation at large too. It strikes me that so much of this revolves around basic issues of economic justice. That if you're poor, you're
Right.
more likely to end up in jail.
Yeah.
And of course, in a tale of two cities, in which a disproportionate number of people of color are poor, here in Madison, that's one of the explanations for why so many African Americans and others are incarcerated.
And that was even true in Juneau County. There are crimes of poverty. You know, if you can't make bail, that means you sit until your case is adjudicated.
Yeah.
And if you have a fine and can't pay it, then you can lose your license. You know, all sorts of things can happen as a result of that. So it is, there are crimes of poverty. The one hopeful thing in Dane County that I'm excited about is there's a foundation now that is looking at setting up a revolving bail fund. And Sheriff Mahoney, I think, has to be commended because also several hundred people are on ankle bracelets, so they can be in the community and still kept track of. But one other interesting thing in terms of
Yeah.
economics that I want to mention is the whole private prison thing. I think it's a large number of the federal prison system that has been farmed out to, you know, like Corrections Corporation of America. And that is a really dangerous thing because they now have a vested interest in having as many people imprisoned as possible. And what they also try to do, because they're profit making, is they cut services to the bone. And there are horror stories from some of the private prisons in terms of people being treated miserably, of you know, it just being a really, really bad situation. So we have, it's kind of like on the military side, we now have private security contractors.
Right.
You know, the $1,000 hammers and the cost plus contracts where there's no effort to save money. We just farm it out, and these corporations make money hand over fist. And so again, there's that link in terms of the powerful making money off of systems of misery.
And it doesn't exist in isolation. What's happening in the correction system, it's tied to these other
Exactly.
things. You mentioned privatization, the incident that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, where a young black man was pummeled. That was a private security firm that had a horrible record. But because they were a private security firm, they weren't subject to all the accountability that a government employed person would be. And so it's part of this bigger picture.
Yeah.
Again, economic justice is just intricately tied together. I just wanted to mention one other positive thing, because there are positives. There are people who are trying to make a difference and trying to reform the system.
Yeah.
In the early 1990s, two of my best friends were visiting the Dane County Jail and established a library there. And over the years, the system of just providing books for people, and you probably benefited from that there were books that you could actually read when you were
Right. Oh, it was wonderful.
there. That then evolved into, well, we should also provide brochures about social service agencies that could help someone with an addiction challenge or with needed child care services or whatever the need might be. Well, maybe we could help people get a job, or we could give them books that will help them figure out what it is they could be doing, and resources in terms of job listings and things like that. So a whole constellation of services came out of what was basically just a book distribution service. And this is something that's won national awards. I was proud because I helped write the first grant that got it funded, and we got number one in the state of these projects. So what you're saying is, I mean, in the context of a county facility like this, that 3 weeks or year or whatever that period is that's seen as relatively brief could be this time of opportunity where you then launch people hopefully out of the incarceration experience into something better.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely what needs to happen. In Dane County, there are 3 organizations that I think are hopeful. One is Madison Area Lutheran Council, and it's not really just Lutheran. What they do is fund a full-time chaplain for men and a part-time chaplain for women. and they are there every day. They do worship service, but they also do counseling. They also provide, and congregations give them, greeting cards, writing paper, all of the little amenities that you need, toothbrushes and whatever. So they're there, and they also, interestingly enough, they call it a ministry of presence, and they try to be present both for the deputies and for the prisoners. The other group is MUM, Madison Area Urban Ministry, and they for years have been doing re-entry programs for people who've gotten out of jail, and you get out. I got out at 7:30 in the morning with whatever you came in with, and that's it. No ride, no,
Yeah.
no nothing. And for many people, that is a really difficult time because they have to find housing, they have to find work, they have to, all of the things to reestablish your life. And so MUM works a lot with that kind of program. And the other one is Moses. Moses, it's Madison Organized for Empowerment, Solidarity, and I can't remember the next thing. But
We have the
yeah,
website up now,
I think,
mosesmadison.org.
yeah. And they have been doing a lot of work on the local jail. Dane County is talking about building a new jail, in part because the old one actually is in 3 separate places. It's the Huber Center, which is on the south side of Madison. It's the sort of dormitory-style housing or pod-style housing that was similar to Juneau County, and that's several floors above the safety building. And then there's the 1953 Alcatraz-like linear cells and cell blocks.
Yeah.
And they're just not working. The several times they haven't been able to open the doors for 3 hours, and so it's a safety hazard. The other thing that happens in so many jails, and is also true of Dane County, and actually Juneau County has what they call isolation cells. Here they're called solitary confinement cells.
Yeah.
But juveniles have to be kept apart from adult population. And now that we have this stupid law, in my opinion, of having 17 and 18-year-olds be treated as adults, well, in fact, younger than that even, they end up in a solitary confinement cell. Or if you have somebody physically disabled, or you have somebody under the influence, or you have somebody who's psychotic, they have to be separated too, and there's no other place than these 6x9 solitary confinement cells.
So tiny little rooms.
Tiny little rooms with
You-
a metal bed and a toilet.
And you're sensorily deprived. You don't
Totally.
You don't have any kind of
No.
output. Any way to interact or to think or to enjoy music or
Right.
anything. So it's very inhumane. Actually, and our sheriff was quoted in an article, a series that the Cap Times did a couple months ago, I think, in which is partly the advocacy that we need a new jail facility, but it's just talking about. He doesn't want to countenance doing these inhumane things
No.
anymore, and that's what solitary confinement's all
Actually,
about.
Sheriff Mahoney
yeah.
has a great line. He talks about the Dane County Jail. He said 20% of the people are dangerous. They're predators. They need to be here. He said the other 80% are just people we're mad at.
Yeah.
And I think we really need to get over our
So off of that, let's just a couple of loose threads I wanted to bring in. Maybe you mentioned this before, but again, just your viewing of the way folks are treated. So I think you were able to make some outgoing calls,
the phone
but
thing is
on the other hand, the cost.
and it's part of that privatizing. You could get, when I came in, and I think you maybe have a picture of me, ringing the bell because I was turning myself in, but my husband and son were with me. And we did this via intercom, and our 2 questions were, when exactly do I get out on Sunday, because that was the 5th day, and how do I make phone calls? Well, I was able to, I had enough money with me to buy a phone card, which was 50 cents an hour. But I wasn't able to get it until the day after.
50 cents an hour or a minute, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, 50 cents a minute.
Yeah.
Excuse me, 50
Yeah.
cents a minute. And that very quickly ran out within a day or two. And so my husband, there's a company called Securus. And he was able to put money into my account, and then I could make a collect call, which he had to accept. But it's like $1.50 a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, it is absolutely outrageous because you feel so cut off from the world. And especially, as I said, I went in voluntarily. I had support. I knew when I was going to get out. The women didn't have those things, and so phone calls are terribly important. And in fact, there's indications and studies about if you have maintained contact with family and friends, you are much less likely to reoffend.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And so, families have to come up with $1.50 a minute. I mean, it's outrageous.
So the irony you're pointing out, and if we can put the slide up, with a book called Burning Down the House, author was Nell Bernstein. I interviewed her recently, and this was in the context of the juvenile justice system. But what she advocates in this title, Burning Down the House, essentially, and she didn't come to this conclusion until after she looked at the situation across the country in different institutions, how we treat young people. Again, this disproportionate way that our country, by a factor of 5 or 20 times, the number of young people we put in, that there was just something contradictory to what a young person needed who was struggling, whether it was a mental health issue or whether it's an addiction issue or not having adequate family support or becoming involved with the gang. The antidote to that is more community engagement, is hooking up with mentors, with tutors, with teachers, with people that the rest of us depend on when we're that age to get supported. But instead, you're locked up in an institution where you're behind the walls, you don't have access to it. A phone call costs $1.50 a minute. So suddenly you're isolated and you're placed in a condition that's going to dehumanize you rather than bringing you back into the community. And it's true for adults as well.
Oh, yeah, it is. It's very true. That was one thing. If there was a surprise, it was how dehumanizing it is and how your self-esteem is eroded by just the way you're treated. And juveniles, that is totally unconscionable.
Yeah.
It is just so counterproductive and so mean-spirited. The one thing that is happening that I think is hopeful in Dane County, and I'm actually going to write a letter to the jail administrator in Juneau County and make some suggestions as well. But there's going to be a restitution court in South Madison, and it is for offenders from 17 to 24, not offenders, people who have been arrested. And the whole idea is to keep them out of the criminal justice system, is for somebody to talk to them and see what went on in their lives at the time, and then for it's not a jury really, but from a peer group to come up with a program of restitution. And that is exactly what we need. And there ought to be multiple ones of these programs in every neighborhood.
One of the things that Nell Bernstein says in her book is no one asks that question, what got you here?
Exactly.
What are the circumstances that caused your life to be in crisis, that produced the stresses, that produced the need, or whatever? We already talked about this, but there's also the heroin epidemic that's going on right now that is the source of a lot of people going into jail. On the other hand, it's disproportionately going to be poor people and people of color who do that because they don't have treatment options. They don't have access to that kind of thing. But it's just again, everything is turned on its head. You're doing exactly the opposite of what you would hope would be your goal. Rehabilitation or restorative justice really is in everyone's best interest.
Oh yeah, one of the women, her boyfriend kicked her out. She was homeless. She didn't report to her probation officer, so she's back in. And all of her worldly possessions are stored in the booking area. This isn't a, and so many of all over the state, a large proportion of the people that end up back in jail or prison are there because they were on probation, not because they committed a crime. It's a technical violation. They either didn't report, they used email, whatever. And that's also counterproductive. I mean,
So it's kind of self-fulfilling recidivism that for
Yeah.
really trivial
Yeah.
reasons people end up going back to the institution. Yeah.
right. I'm part of a group called Campaign Nonviolence, and one of the things that happens is every day you get email, and I did a reflection of my time in jail and what it meant to me. And I just want to quote this because I think it's exactly what's going on, and it connects both our warfare and our militarism and our use of force and confinement, in the jails. But it says, no one today can afford to be innocent or to indulge themselves in ignorance of the nature of contemporary governments, politics, and social orders. The national polities of the modern world are states, which maintain their existence by deliberately fostered craving and fear. And what they are is monstrous protection rackets.
Yeah.
We are in fact being told we've got to have drone warfare in the world's biggest military because otherwise you're not going to be safe. And so we give the money, and it goes to war profiteers.
Yeah.
And we're told the same thing in terms of jails. We're going to protect you. We'll just build more jails and more prisons and more ways of confining people, and then you're going to be safe. And it's exactly the opposite.
And I think we touched on this, but it's important to say it's not just the person who's incarcerated that is affected by this. It's its families, its children.
Yeah.
I think we have a graphic picture of a young woman who was raising her child essentially in the context of the jails. And you had some experiences with that up in Juneau County, right?
Yeah, the women, there were 12 children. Between them, they had 12 children. One was a 1-year-old, whose mother, fortunately, the child's grandmother, the inmate's mother, was taking care of her. But several were in foster care. And so, yes, families are affected. And I know my husband he was worried. It was hard for him when I was there because he didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
And as I said, the phone calls were important. So yeah, it affects families especially, and
then,
especially children.
And then while a parent is in an institution for the children who are back at home, as you said, that means that other people have to raise the children, all kind of support systems have to come into place. Yeah. They may or may not have regular contact with the parent who's incarcerated. And groups like the Madison Urban Ministry are working on that issue too. Yeah.
It's critical. We somehow need to not. I think we're in denial.
Yeah.
We really don't want to deal with this stuff because it is. I mean, these are difficult issues, and yet unless we face it, and unless we start acting more humanely, and unless we get smarter, we're going to keep on having exactly more of the same. And it just doesn't make sense to me. I really, I sometimes say I'm a recovering attorney. I practiced law for a number of years and then went to work for peace and justice organizations. But I really know from firsthand experience, and part of the reason I left law practice was that I often felt that, yes, my clients had done something wrong, especially I did a lot of juvenile public defender appointments. But I really felt our systems ought to be on trial.
Yeah.
That it is our systemic way of doing things that are bad, and that people get enmeshed and hurt.
You mentioned several times, I think, allusions to again the Lutheran Church, of which you work on many social justice initiatives. We may have touched on this, but of course, during the time that you were in jail, there were many people in your own home congregation of St. John's Lutheran, and then throughout the city and around the nation, actually, I think that we're praying for you. They're offering that dimension of support. But the irony, of course, is that you were in jail during probably the holiest week of the year.
Yes.
The time between Palm Sunday and you were released on Easter morning. And I just can't help but appreciate the irony of that. But where I guess, to editorialize a bit here, is that so often as Christians, people justify a lot of the actions we're talking about, penalizing people, pointing fingers at them, stigmatizing them, making them seem less than human. That, for those of us who are the Christian faith, that strikes me as profoundly un-Christ-like. It's not the way that Christ treated people.
Oh, no. No, and part of our calling is to visit those in prison.
Yeah.
You know, and Jesus announced the whole, you know, when he announced his ministry, I've come to set the captives free. One of the things I did, and because it was Holy Week on Good Friday, I read the four gospel accounts of the last days of Jesus, and it was so striking to me because one, it's in John, I think it's John 18:37. Pilate is questioning Jesus, and he says, "I've come to talk about the truth, or speak about the truth." And I thought, yes, that is what we all need to do. I think we really need to speak truth to power. We need to say, no, this is not what we want done in our name. This is not how we want to live. This is not how we want our tax money spent. So I think.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, we're
No,
down to
I
our
think
last. We're down to our last 7 months, but I just want to give you a chance. You know, in light of all you've learned, all of this you've experienced, and everything, the recommendations that you're going to make to the Junie County Jail, and you know, and some of the other things here. I guess, can you vision what a world would look like, what an approach would look like? There probably are people that will end up in jail, people who do violence and do harm to other people. We do need to protect it. You know, it's not that there isn't a basis for that, but you know, there are a lot of other folks, it sounds like, don't belong there. There are a lot of other ways that we treat people wrongly. We don't give them a chance for redemption, for a chance to have a life after being incarcerated. And now probably about 3 minutes. What would that world look like?
Well, I think internationally, I think it would be a disarmed world. We would not be spending, and the U.S. spends 50% of our income tax dollars on past and current military expenditures. I think we wouldn't do that anymore. I think that we would have, we might have the National Guard, you know, who originally were to protect people if there were natural disasters, you know, if there was, you know, some immediate need for having people, you know, well, the guardians, not warriors, kind of an idea. And I think in terms of prisons, there's actually a group in Madison called No Jails. And there are some programs where people are trying to do alternative programs, diversion programs, you know, the restitution courts, the diversion so that mentally ill and addicted people get treatment. The Wisdom, which is a statewide group, and actually on the 29th of April are having a lobbying day, are trying to focus on cutting prison population in half by the end of this year. I mean, they've been working now for several years on this. And there are ways to do that without compromising our safety.
And we should mention, I think everybody's aware of this finally, but that, yeah, in Dane County, by a factor of more than 50 to 1, there's disproportionate incarceration of African Americans.
Oh, it's awful.
There are all kinds of different inequities and injustices that are rooted in a lot of the things we've
Yeah,
talked about.
I think the racism is clearly something else that we need to deal with, and poverty.
So once again, for folks wanting to make a difference, Moses is one of the options here locally.
Right, Moses and Madison Area Urban Ministry. And I think just a couple of great books. I mean, I think Michelle Alexander's book on the new Jim Crow is really good. The Race to Equity report that was done by the Wisconsin Council on Children and Families spells out that awful picture of the disproportionate nature of African Americans being enmeshed in the criminal justice system.
Bonnie Black, thank you for these 2 hours of conversation. Again, if you haven't seen the first hour, please do go to the website of the Sun Prairie Media Center, and forwardforum@aol.com is a way that you can provide feedback, future ideas for our shows. We thank you, our audience, for your participation. Bonnie, thank you so much for your courage and for translating and attempting to transform a difficult experience into something people can learn from.
Thank you. I appreciate having the time.
All right. This has been Forward Forum. I'm your host, John Quinlan. We'll see you next week.